And he says, what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you. What? It is not up in heaven that you have to say who will go reach it for us. It's not beyond the sea, so you have to send somebody to search it out and bring it back to you. No, the word of God is near you. It is in your heart and in your mouth that you might obey it, that you might do it. Now, if somebody gave you 490 rules and then said, you can do it, you're probably not going to leave going, woo-hoo-hoo, 418, 419. You're going to leave going, what in the, I can't even remember what number 4 was. And so here's Deuteronomy. The name of the book literally means the second law, or the law a second time. Because Moses was repeating what he'd already told them. Because nobody wrote it down. Because they weren't intended to. They were to interact with it. They were to hear it. They were to receive it into themselves, not put it in a book. Because it wasn't against them, it was for them. It was to form them. It was to shape them. It was to build character. It was to set boundaries. Don't do this. Don't cross this boundary. That's not a negative thing. How many of you have trained children and have had to tell them more than once, don't do that? It's not because you hate them, it's because you love them. And you want to keep on loving them and not become so exasperated that you kill them and give them back to the God who blessed you with them in the first place and tell them that they died. And God said the same thing. These laws are not against you, they're for you. And so then we get into the weird dynamics of thinking, man, some of that law gets kind of strange. Don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk or you will be cursed. I'm on it. Got it. But then others are like, well, wait a minute, Lord. Yesterday I was smoking some ribs in my smoker, pork ribs, and studying about the law. It says, thou shalt not consume any unclean animal. And I'm thinking, I'm a lawbreaker, but it smells awesome. And then, of course, we look at it from the New Testament where God says, don't call anything unclean that I've called clean. And the reason that God has all of these rules, all these, especially the prohibitions and the dietary laws, is because those were either animals or plants or products that would carry disease, sickness, as they, especially in the desert climate in which they lived and as they proceeded into the promised land, that God wanted to bring them out of the wilderness into the promise. So what I want us to do for the next 8 weeks is, as a church family, to go back and take a look at not only the laws and what God spoke through Moses, but the principles behind them, which are more important. The heart of God behind what he instructs us. But I want us to look back as New Testament believers, not as those who were there trying to find their way forward. And the principle there is solid for us. I was talking about the cancellation of debts, and we most of us really like that one. But in the sense of how effective and contemporary the laws were that God spoke thousands of years ago. And there are 2 scriptures that I want us to kind of bridge from this morning. I already mentioned our key verse for this series is chapter 30, verses 19 and 20. And so I'll read that to you. It says, now I have set before you today life and death, blessing and cursing. Now choose life. Everybody say, choose life.
Choose life.
That's not just a pro-life slogan. It's a good one, but it's more than just choose to give your child life. Choose life. Choose the life that I'm setting before you. Choose to live well. Choose to love well. And in those areas of our life where we struggle, in those areas of our life where we feel like we are where Israel was, that we're in the wilderness, we're in the weeds somewhere. God said, you've stayed at this mountain long enough. Now move into the hill country. And then he spoke to him, said, you've stayed in the hill country long enough. Now let's move into the valley. And God even spoke to them in the valley of Eshcol and said, now we're getting ready to cross the Jordan into the land God has promised us. That God speaks into the very place, listen to me, God speaks into the very place where you are. God speaks into your wilderness. God speaks to you in the dry place. God speaks to you in the valley to lead you into what he's promised. So let's make it contemporary. Let's put it in the present tense, not just for us in our culture, but you in your life, you in your family, you at whatever age you are right now. What are the things that you're believing God for that you haven't seen yet? Because every promise is yes in Christ Jesus. And through us, the amen is spoken. It's the same word that God spoke to them. I've given you this land. Now you go possess it. Well, why do we have to go possess it if you've already given it to us? There are so many believers that have that immature attitude in their life. If God made me a promise, why don't I see that promise in my life? If God promised me healing, why am I healed? If God's a good God, why do bad things happen? And we have this wrong image of God, so we have the wrong image of ourselves and of our lives. We have a wrong image of what the promise is supposed to look like. Even when they entered into the promised land, they still had to fight battles. Oh, great. Here we go again. And when you enter into the land of promise, the things that God has promised you, you're still going to have to work through some spiritual warfare. That there are enemies in that land, but the enemies aren't always physical. Sometimes those enemies are spiritual, and the enemy wants to come and steal the word of God from your heart. And he wants to come and put his word or a word of complaining or a word of doubt or a word of frustration in your mouth. Because God said, my word is to be in your heart and in your mouth. What are you saying about your life? What are you confessing over your situation? What are you declaring? Because God didn't just say to Moses, give these laws to the people. Tell them what the rules are. He said, speak these words to the people of the commands, the decrees, and the blessings I am giving you this day. Are you walking in the blessing of God in your life and what he's promised you? That's more than just money, but it involves money. Are we walking in the ways and the principles that God spoke over their lives to get them into that promise? It becomes, when we have boundaries in our life, they're not bad things, they're good things. Why is there supposed to be a yellow line on the outside of the highway that you're driving on? Why is there a ditch on one side and a ditch on the other? So that they could elevate the highway, so that you're not driving through water or whatever's on the highway, that it's raised. And God wants to raise your life and put it on this highway and then give some clear boundaries. Don't drive on the other side of the line. Why is there a center line? So you don't go over in my lane when you're coming my way. Why is there a left lane? So that I can drive in the left lane and you're supposed to drive in the right lane. That last part was a joke, but are you with me here? That God puts boundaries all around in our life, and they're to help us, to benefit us, to move on more smoothly and efficiently. Now watch this. When I was thinking about some of those laws, and then I thought about my own kids, I thought about me walking through debt, student loan debt, and many of you. And so I thought, what an awesome thing if we would just go back and recover that one concept of the law and then apply it in our modern culture. And here's the incredible thing. God said every 7 years the debt would be canceled. And you think, well, that's ridiculous. That would never work. Really? Well, it's working pretty well for them. Still, in Israel, one of the smallest nations in the world, has one of the strongest economies. And so if we did that and said, okay, you can borrow money to go to school if you want, and there's all these programs, and you can pay on that for 7 years. And at the end of every 7 years, that debt's going to be canceled. How many of you would find new cause for rejoicing in the house of the Lord? Serious. Well, how incredible would that be? That every 7 years, you get a brand new start. Well, that's just going to make people irresponsible. And God said, no, the deal is, you don't understand how much I can provide for you. And you're not to put burdens on one another that you can't take off. Because I don't do that for you. That God said when you live in the power of blessing, then you can't be bullies. Another contemporary thing. What's the biggest social issue among young people in schools and whatever? Bullying. And it's a real issue. Why? Because we hadn't taught our kids the basic principles of how to respect one another. Because they haven't watched their parents respect one another. They haven't watched their parents respect God. They haven't watched their parents respect authority. And so from generation to generation, we keep lowering the standard instead of raising it. And so everything that God spoke to in his law, he raised the standard. It's interesting as you study it, some theologians even say, well, you know, really this concept comes from a Moabite law or a different code from one of the nations around Israel, and they borrowed the form or they borrowed the language from that code. But in every single case, no matter what he's addressing, even the issue of slavery. Oh, see, that's horrible because God condoned slavery. No, he did not. He raised the standard to such a degree that he made it and saying, if you have a servant that has worked for you or a slave that you have acquired, and when it comes time in the sixth year to release them and to let them go, and they want to stay, then you bless them. And they become a part of your family. Now, if the whole dynamic would have been so horrible, what idiot would have ever wanted to stay? In other words, God said, this whole deal isn't about oppressing people. It's about meeting people where they are and bringing them in and living your life at such a high standard that they want to be like you. I know that's tough, but God spoke into very difficult situations. When he spoke about canceling debts, when he spoke about legal issues. In fact, he frames the entire aspect of Deuteronomy in a legal code of the day. That the establishment of covenant was made verbally. Seldom was there a record of it. Meaning, you need to be a man of your word. And there were always conditions that if I break this covenant with you that I'm making today, may my life be cursed. You would speak those words. And so God says, I set heaven and earth before you today as witnesses, a legal term. That when there's an issue, if there's a disagreement, if there's a breaking of covenant, even in our legal system, which it's all based on Old Testament law, if you come down to it, it's not applied nearly as well and efficiently and in the Spirit of the Lord, but nonetheless, that you have an opportunity to come and present witnesses. And so God's not saying these witnesses are testifying against you. He's saying, I'm the God of heaven, and I'm involved in your lives on the earth. I'm not the God out there somewhere. I'm not the man upstairs. I'm not the one watching you from heaven. I'm not like all these other nations around you where their gods cannot be known and seen. I'm the God who makes myself known as Father. Even in all the way back in Deuteronomy, through the law, I'm the dad who sets the rules. And when we see God and approach him in that way, it changes the whole dynamic. That when he's given us instruction, it's to help us and to father us. Even as he said that there are severe consequences for breaking the covenant, it's not like God's putting a headlock on them and making them become his servants. That he said that if you violate this covenant, if you find yourself banished even to a land far away, even from there, if you seek me, you'll be found by me, for I am a merciful God. See, he's given them a history lesson. He's telling them that this process isn't just to be this ancient deal about, well, you know, our forefathers served God, but it was kind of rough. That he said, bring it into the present tense and the context in which you live in your life. I want to meet you there. And he says, in that way, that not only will I walk with you and live with you, this relevance, this blessing will begin to flow over in your life. Then he said in chapter 4, after a long time when you've lived in the land and you have children and grandchildren, and that your heart just kind of, we've served God a long time. And that you tend to slack off and you forget God. Know that God will not forget you. And that he remembers his covenant with you. And you realize, man, look how far we've got away from God. Generations, we've served him for years. Somebody said to me recently, they were kind of struggling in their relationship with the Lord and said, I don't know, I guess I'm just bored. And I'm thinking, man, you must be serving a different God than me. Seriously. Because this God says there's nothing boring about living a life for him. In fact, he brings it to the point where when you're struggling and you're wrestling, and today, again, I set before you, right in your presence, where you are, in your situation, in your context, I set before you a choice. Life, death, blessing, cursing. Choose life. And here's the thing I love. He didn't just say choose life for you. It's not just a selfish choice. Because the life you live matters. It matters for your kids. The choices you make today matter for your kids and your grandkids. Because God is a God of generations. Not just a God of the moment in decisions that are made and so then boom, poof, your life is blessed, your debts are canceled, all your stuff is great, look at my life, oh boy, I'm having fun now. God meets you in the wilderness. God speaks to you as you're walking through difficult terrain in the hill country in your walk with him. God meets you in the valley of the shadow of death, and he shepherds you through that process into everything he promised you. But if his word doesn't remain in your heart, if his word doesn't come out of your mouth, instead, if it's complaining and questioning and doubt and fear and unbelief, just like God spoke to them, then we'll wrestle, we'll struggle like they did. When they began to experience some of the negative ramifications of choices against God, and they took it upon themselves and said, okay, we don't want to go up and fight, but because you said so, okay, we'll go now. And God said, no, don't go. I'm not with you. Timing is everything. But nonetheless, you would not listen. So they went up to fight. They got whipped. They came back down. And here's what they said. God hates us. God just brought us out here to kill us. And God said, listen, for 400 years you were slaves. And with a mighty hand I set you free. And it was an 11-day journey to get into the promised land. And we spent 40 years taking that 11-day journey in order to test you, to know what was in your heart, to know whether or not you really understood who I was, and you would let me know you. That's kind of our approach. Some of us say, man, I spent 9 years at a 4-year institution getting my degree or whatever. It's like, man, it's taken a little bit longer than what I anticipated here, Lord. And he said, right, I understand that. God's willing to take as long as it takes. 40 years is a generation, by the way. And God said, there was a generation who knew me in deliverance, but they don't know me in intimacy. They don't know me in my presence. They don't know me in relationship. And so we can see the big picture. And we can look past just recent church history. There was a generation, and generations of believers have been marked. There was a generation of hippies who didn't know anything about the Lord and were just living weird lives in the 70s. And it started this Jesus movement and this whole influx of people who knew nothing about organized religion and everything about drugs, sex, rock and roll. And God transformed their lives. Well, newsflash, it isn't 1974 any longer. And so it's not like we go back and say, do it again, do it again. But God said, look at the past. Look at the ancient past. Look at the times of long ago and bring them into the present where you are. Let me speak to you. Let me show you who I am. Is anybody with me this morning? All right, and so our whole approach is this. Here's the other aspect of that scripture. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 32 through 40. Here, Deuteronomy is this process of looking back to gain a new vision for moving ahead. Let me say that again. In looking back, it's not just at the past going, oh man. It's not, I wish I was back in the olden days. Looking back is not just in a negative sense of, oh man, that was horrible. Looking back is to gain a new vision for moving ahead. And it's exactly what God said. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 32. Ask now. Notice what he says. Ask. Ask now. Let's interact with your history, with your heritage. Let me explain something to you. Not just, when I was a kid, we had to walk to school in snow barefoot 49 miles. And schoolhouse was only a mile down the road, but, or whatever. It's like, oh, Grandpa, great. Here we go with stories again. God didn't say, let me tell you a story. God initiated, ask about your past. Ask about your heritage. Ask about where you come from. Ask about where I was in the midst of your history. Listen to this. Ask now about the former days, long before your time. From the day God created human beings on the earth, ask from one end of the heavens to the other, has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has anything like it ever been heard of? One of the key aspects of the book of Deuteronomy is that it's God's way into covenant relationship. Another huge aspect of the book of Deuteronomy is it's a new call to greatness. I realize we could get very contemporary with that, and God's not wearing a red hat saying, "Make America great again." That's Donald Trump, and that's a good slogan, and we need to. But we're living in a day, in a contemporary time, when people are intimidated by greatness. And so it's not enough to be great. It's just enough to be normal, to fit in. We're living in a day of participation trophies rather than the greatness of personal excellence. Living well, living with a spirit of excellence. And it's God's call to greatness. Has anything so great ever happened? Has any other people ever heard the voice of God speaking out of a fire and lived? Two key words. Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by testings, by signs, by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds, like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? Can I just put this out there for you this morning? Put the cookies on the bottom shelf. Where did he do those things? In Egypt. In a place of bondage, slavery. And what did he do? Mighty miracles. Sometimes we can't see the mighty miracle we're living when we're still in bondage. Where's God? Where's his miracles? You're living them. Go get a lamb and kill it and place its blood on the doorposts of your home, because tonight death will pass over every house where I see the blood. Tomorrow morning, you're not going to see this as a miracle because you're still in bondage, but you're getting into freedom. They didn't even understand the freedom that they were walking in. So God said, sometimes we got to get in a place of freedom and look back and realize how far we've really come. Where was God in all this? With you every step of the way. I love the poem Footprints in the Sand. And then when we look back, there's a place where there's no footprints. There's only one set of footprints. And God said, that's when I was carrying you. But I believe that we're living in a day of called butt prints in the sand. And there's a set of footprints, and then there's just this big groove. And God said, that's when you refused to let me carry you, so I drug you through the sand. Finally, a breakthrough. Yes, Lord, they're getting the revelation now. Hallelujah. Because some of you are going, I've been there. I know. Should we stop and pray again? All the awesome deeds that I did in Egypt before your very eyes. Verse 35. You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord is God. And beside him there is no other. From heaven he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth he showed you his great fire. And you heard his words from out of the fire, because he loved your ancestors and chose their descendants after them. He brought you out of Egypt by his presence and his great strength, to drive out before you nations greater and stronger than you, and bring you into their land, to give it to you for your inheritance as it is today. He said, let me give you a little snapshot of your past. Let me give you a little documentary of where you've come from, son, and who brought you here. Don't mistake your understanding of the miracles of God when you were in bondage now that you're free. And don't take advantage of the freedom and misunderstand what it took to get you here. We've just celebrated Independence Day in America, and the slogan was repeated many times, freedom ain't free. I think only people who've been directly touched, and profoundly so, by the death of someone in honor, willing to give their life and pay the ultimate sacrifice so that you could live in freedom. How many of us can really, seriously appreciate that? And live that out with a sense of responsibility. Not just burden, not just the heaviness and guilt of that, but in a true sense of making it worthwhile. Verse 39, then God said, acknowledge and take to heart this day. Acknowledge it. But then take it to heart. What does it mean? That the Lord is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Keep his decrees and commands, which I'm giving you today, so that it may go well with you and your children. If I ask you today more than just a cursory, surfacey statement, how's it going? Are you living well? Seriously. Could you honestly say, I am living well? Is it Dave Ramsey on his radio show when someone greets him, how are you today? And he always says, better than I deserve. And I'm thinking, good response. But the real question is, are we living well? Here's more specifically. Are you loving well? Love God, love others. When I say, how's your love life? I'm not talking about romance. Are you loving well? Are you loving people in that sense of loving them when they don't love you back? Loving them when they can't respond? Creating an atmosphere where people see there's something different about your life? Is there grace on you? Or are you struggling? Are you pretending and secretly wrestling within your heart? If so, you're not living well and you're not loving well. So that it may go well with you and your children. What if I didn't ask you that question? What if I ask your kids? How's your folks doing? How's your mom and them? How's your dad? And they said, good, good. I said, is he living well? Well, he's living. Is he loving well? Is he loving your mom that makes you feel good? Is he kissing her in the kitchen just to embarrass you? A way that makes you smile. How are they living? How are they processing loss? How are they dealing with difficulties, life, struggles? Happens to all of us, one day at a time. See, and God said, the reason I'm giving you these boundaries, the reason I want to bring you into covenant is so you can live well, so you can love well, and so that your kids can experience genuine blessing. Not that you can leave them a little something. Not that their life can be better than yours. That's a good goal. sometimes it spoils them too. And they don't have the character to maintain it. So God said, we're bringing this in. And then he says, after you, and that you may live long in the land the Lord your God gives you for all time. Now, people misquote that. You know, one of the commandments that God gives in chapter 5 is honor your father and mother so that you can live long. It's not what he said. Honor your father and mother so that it will go well with you and you can live long in the land. God always says that. So to go well with you and you can live long. Who wants to live long in the land if it's not going well for you? Come on, I talk to people all the time that are struggling, and it's like, I'm just ready to go home. I don't want to live long. I've lived long enough. I want to go home. And I get it. But for people who are living well, every day's a gift. And when we're not, it becomes a struggle. And God said he's speaking to them in a place of struggle in the wilderness and in the valley, saying, listen, I want to get you into the place of promise. Not that all your problems are going to go away, but you're going to begin to live in this level of blessing, and you can be a blessing to people. And as you walk through that, it's an incredible thing. Jeremiah 6 says the same thing. In looking back to move ahead and move forward, he says, this is what the Lord says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it. And you will find rest for your souls. What God was giving them was the ancient path, the good way. What he was promising them was rest for their souls. Jeremiah prophesied it years after that, but here God was giving them a path, a map for them to live it and to walk that out. I mentioned a couple of these, but here again are the big ideas in the book of Deuteronomy. It's the way into covenant relationship with God. The way in. How can we not only know about God, but genuinely know him? It's the building of character and healthy boundaries. God's establishing that within them. It's the calling to greatness, which is living with distinction and excellence. It's not like every other nation around you. It's not adopting their practices. It's being, instead of fitting in, it's that power to stand out and to do so well. Living with distinction and excellence. Here's what I want to see just before we finish. The covenant that God was bringing them into was personal. It was intimate. It was interactive. That it wasn't just this arbitrary set of rules. It wasn't just, volumes of, you better not mess up. That God was using that to bring them to a place where it brought them to himself. And every time, he said, it's not just rules that you memorize. He said, hear them and let them get all the way down in your heart. And then out of your heart, let them come back out of your mouth. And he said, as they do, impress them on your children. Talk about them as you walk along the pathway, and when you lay down at night, when you rise up in the morning. It's this process that it wasn't to be this once a week thing. It's to be everything about our life is formed by God and in him and for him. And in this process, they had carried such a wrong image of God that they had a wrong perception of themselves. This week, as I was studying, I was reading a thing from Eugene Peterson, who translated the Message Bible, and I love this quote. He said, if we believe wrong things about God, we will think wrong things about ourselves, and we will live meanly and badly. And I'm thinking, wow. Looking around at our nation, I believe we're probably believing some wrong things about God, because we're sure thinking some wrong things about ourselves. Because the fruit of that is we're stinking mean. And so many people are living badly. What did God say? If you walk in this way of covenant, not only will you live well, you'll love well. Peterson goes on to say, telling a person a lie about God distorts reality, perverts life, and damages the processes of living. I would like to change that. Believing a lie about God does the same thing. Distorts reality. What's real? It perverts life. It becomes this weird thing of less than what God intended for it to be. It perverts life. And it damages the processes of living. You know, it's not life that people struggle with. It's the processes of living many times. Have you noticed there's some processes to everybody's life? Paying bills, signing contracts, driving your car. It's a process. It's not an instant thing. You don't get there. Sometimes you got to repeat it, and it's just the process. It's just what we go through. It's a stage. It's a process. It's necessary. And sometimes it's so frustrating, not the process itself, sometimes the people that you have to interact with to go through the process. Incompetence and incapability and whatever. Are you with me? And so understanding that when we have the right perception of God and we believe the right things about ourselves, it improves the processes of our life. We just realize it's another step that we have to go through. And that's what God was saying to them. You can't stay here in the mountains. You can't stay in the hill country. You can't stay in the valley. That's your land over there. Now there's a process to getting it. You have to go possess it. I'm going to be with you every step of the way. No, none of those nations will be able to stand up against you. You'll meet resistance, but you'll overcome it all because I've already given it to you. Well, then why do we have to go through the process of getting it? Because life has processes. And those processes are meant to bring us back right here to what God speaks. To get his word in our heart, to put his word in our mouth, to believe it, to begin to live it, to see that the process isn't just a mechanical thing, it's a relational dynamic that brings us into where God wants us to be. Is anybody getting that this morning? Man. So here's what he says. Is when God introduces this law or reintroduces it, if you will, in Deuteronomy the second time, he also reintroduces himself. Just a couple of verses here. Deuteronomy 1, verses 29 through 31. Then I said to you, do not be terrified and do not be afraid of them. God's word to Moses about the nations that they were facing. The Lord your God who is going before you. Notice he's there in that present tense. Going before you will fight for you as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes and in the wilderness. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his son all the way you went until you reached this place. Sometimes we look at our life and we think, how did I get here? And that could be a negative statement or a positive one. Depends on how well you navigated the processes. And God said many times, I carried you here. God, I don't even know how I got here. I know. You weren't real sharp. I carried you. You were kind of out of it. I carried you. You didn't understand that this was about rescue, and we didn't have a lot of time to explain the procedures. The building was collapsing, and we had to get you out. That environment was toxic and unhealthy, and we had to get you out. And so God establishes that. In Deuteronomy 4, again, he says these words, after you have had children and grandchildren and have lived in the land a long time, if you then become corrupt and make any kind of idol, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord your God and arousing his anger, I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you this day, that you will quickly perish from the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. You'll not live there long, and you'll certainly be destroyed. Now, did God say, I'm going to kill you? No. He said, look, if you forget the things that got you there, it'll kill you. You'll perish, you'll be destroyed. The land will scatter you among the people, and only a few of you will survive from the nations which the Lord is going to drive you. There you will worship man-made gods of wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or eat or smell. But if from there you seek the Lord your God, you will find him. If you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul, when you're in distress and all these things have happened to you, then in later days you'll return to the Lord your God and obey him. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your ancestors, which he confirmed to them by oath. Here's the words again from Deuteronomy 30. At the end of it, Moses wraps it up with the words of the Lord. Now, what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond